Hi everyone, welcome to the first content-based lecture of the course. As you might imagine, we start right at the beginning of things, and what I'd like to do for you today is talk a little bit about the colonial images, some of the most important ones that we have from the Americas, and put those into their context. And then move on in part 2 of this lecture. So I'm going to divide this video into a couple of different parts to early American portraiture, particularly portraiture of the 17th through the kind of mid 19th century or so, early 19th century. So to get us started, I just want to say a couple of things about your textbook again to remind you. And again, what you should see on the screen right now is off to one side my talking head, on the other side what is on my desktop, which is the slide lecture. I think, unless there's some usefulness to looking at me talking to you, maybe it keeps you more interested, I don't know, so you can poke fun at me or something, talking to my computer. I just think it's probably most useful to minimize my talking face and just listen to my voice so that you can maximize the size of the slides that you're looking at and really see the visual images. But of course, that's up to you. Mess around a little bit in Panopto to see how you gain that functionality. So a few words then about getting started on these lectures. Always when you view a lecture, you're going to see a little link to a Word document file before the video itself that is a lecture guide. Hopefully you saw that, and if you didn't already print that out or have that available on your laptop to take notes on it, do that. I find it's really useful, and again, you'll have to deal with this in your own way, whatever works best for you, to have that in front of me and to look at that, because as I said before, I'm not going to caption my slides, but I do put all the names of the artists, the names of the works of art, the dates of the works of art, and the key terminology on the lecture guides themselves. So on this first lecture guide, for instance, you see lecture guide number 1, you see the title of the lecture, and then beneath that you see the first thing you'll see is the artist's name. Then you'll see in italics the titles of the works of art that we're looking at, and it's a good thing to remember that just like book titles, painting titles should be italicized. So when you're writing your papers, keep that in mind. And then in parentheses, the dates of the works of art. Whenever you see a C period and then a date, or a CA period and a date, that means circa. It means somewhere around that date. We're not entirely sure it's exactly that date, but it's somewhere in proximity to that date. Then beneath the titles of the works, if there is terminology that's key to one particular artist, or I think it's very beneficial to have it right there, you'll see a little hash mark and then that terminology. This is terminology that shows up in my lecture, that oftentimes shows up in the text as well, and it's certainly something that we'd like to see you employ when you're writing about these works of art and these topics, right? Using the appropriate terminology as a way to show that you have some fluidity in these subjects. So that's the basic lecture guide. Have that printed out or have that downloaded onto your laptop. You can, as I said before, it's a Word document, actually put your notes directly into that Word document. And again, just like a face-to-face lecture, although you have access to these videos as soon as they're open through the rest of the quarter to return to in case you wanted to review them in advance of writing a paper, it's always a good idea to be taking good notes as you're listening to these. Now, early in the quarter, I will be following some of the ideas in the textbook fairly closely, although the way that the textbook organizes its information, as I mentioned in the first video, is not the same as the way that I'll be organizing my lectures. And as we get into the late 19th, early 20th century, I'll keep moving a little bit further away from the textbook. There's a reason for this. First of all, my area of specialty is really kind of late 19th, early 20th century, and I have a lot of let's say, I wouldn't say disagreements with the way that the text gives you the information, but I do have other points of emphasis that I'm going to want to put during that time period. But the other thing is that I feel like it's always a good idea to start off a course with what I call multiple redundancies. If you hear me talk about it in a lecture, you hear something very similar in the text, not the same. I don't want to bore you to death, of course, but not the same. Something in the text that goes over some of the same ground, but maybe gives you a little bit different emphasis or a little bit more detail. And then you read in our PDF special topics readings, those electronic reserves, even more in-depth analyses of these areas. I think that's a really good way to, again, gain some comfort in these subject areas, which for a lot of people, this is your first art history class. And so I want to make sure that we all have our feet under us early on in the quarter, and then as we go along, we'll move further away from that textbook. For the textbook reading for today, I mentioned that, the first chapter that I point to, kind of skim that over until you get to colonial portraits. But I do want to place emphasis on the first 2 or 3 pages of that chapter, where the historian, Dr. Pohl, goes into depth about basically the way that ideology functions in relation to these works of art. In other words, the way that the beliefs of the people who are producing these works of art and the beliefs of the people who are consuming them, the intended audience, made both the artist and those who consumed it think about these subjects in their own particular way and represent them in their own particular way. Or another way to put this is to say, and hopefully this is at least partially clear in the Introduction to Art History lecture, works of art are not documentaries of what they represent, right? When an artist is representing a person or a landscape or an historical moment, this is not some kind of objective, beyond any perspective or beyond any bias representation. Works of art, like all other forms of representation, are inherently biased, whether the artist intends them to be or not. As I said in the last lecture, they are products of their age and the belief systems of that age, and the works of art that they produce are shot through with those kinds of ideological positions. And so that text, your textbook, does a really good job, I think, beyond the introductory kind of forward, in those first 3 or so pages of the first chapter, when it's talking about Théodore de Bruy's work, of giving you a good sense of what we mean by that. And I will be picking that up today as well. So then while we're here talking about the readings, the special topics readings for this week, Craven's, and by the way, Wayne Craven is an expert in early American portraiture. He's the person that everyone kind of returns to over and again. One required reading that's on basically Calvinism, a Protestant belief system based upon Calvin's way of thinking about things in relation to early American portraiture. And then the next one, which is an optional reading, so you don't have to do it, but if you get interested in this, is really relating that imagery to the 17th century image of the merchant. So just to give you a kind of primer on that. Okay, so then on with the show. I suppose first things first, right? I think most of you have a general idea of the history of the colonization of North America. Remember that in this class we're really talking about primarily Western art, so we're not talking about the arts of the indigenous people of North America, nor are we talking, basically we're talking about the arts of the United States. We don't really look at Canadian art, we don't really look at Mexican art, even though some Mexican art is in your textbook. Really focusing on the United States and the colonization of North America that then leads to the founding of the United States. So that story and what we're talking about here is the context that sets the stage for the works of art that are going to be produced. is very simply put, this. In 1492, of course, we know Columbus setting out from Spain, finally getting a little bit of support, monetary support from Isabella and Ferdinand, the King and Queen of Spain at the time, stumbles upon North America in his attempt to find a new trade route to India, basically to the West Indies in particular. And this is a new find, of course, and what it does is it sets off slowly but surely a kind of competition among the European powers to make use of this new land that they find, right? Now, Spain has a little bit of a head start, and many of you know that Spain basically comes into what is today Mexico, wipes out the Aztec Empire in short order in their pursuit of primarily gold. They're looking for the mythical city of El Dorado, a so-called kind of gold city. And along the way, they did some serious damage to a very important culture of Mexico and what is today Mexico City, the Aztec nation. They also colonized Florida in particular, and you see this on the map in front of you. The areas known as New Spain in pink here are the areas that were initially colonized by the Spanish and remained Spanish colonies through most of the 18th century. And again, just to remind you, I know most of you know this, but every once in a while it trips people up. Historians, of course, when they say the 18th century, they're talking about the 1700s, 19th century, 1800s, and so forth, right? So, so Spain comes in. They don't have a whole lot of success colonizing other parts of the eastern seaboard. Spain is a Catholic nation at this time, as is France, but they're not really getting along. Or rather, the way to put this is the European three major powers, Italy's a little bit less of a power at this stage, Spain, Great Britain or England, and France, are constantly kind of competing with each other, and their allegiances change from time to time. But, any moment that one of them has a chance to get one over on the other, they will take it. At this moment, Spain is the most powerful kind of seafaring force. They're Catholic. The French are also Catholic. This sets them up to be allies in some ways, because the English are, of course, Protestant. And there are a lot of conflicts that began starting again early in the 16th century with the splintering of the Catholic Church, when Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses on the wall of Wittenberg Cathedral in 1518 and starts that big split. There's a lot of divisions in Western Europe along religious grounds. So, generally speaking, the English are going to be in conflict with both the French and the Spanish. Every once in a while, the French and the Spanish join allegiances, but never for very long. You see then the way that North America by the middle of the 18th century is kind of divided up. The British colonies are on what today we would think of as the eastern seaboard of the United States. France comes in through kind of northern Canada and then migrates into kind of the plains areas of what eventually becomes the United States, doing a lot of trapping and so forth. I think that's enough to kind of get us started. But here's where I want to go with this. The importance of these types of conflicts that are happening between the European nations, in particular, the emphasis that is placed upon religious observation, whether you're Catholic or whether you're Protestant, what that means to each side is going to be important in the way that these artists choose to represent their subjects. For someone who is English, for instance, who is Protestant, they believe that the Spanish and the Catholics are a cult of luxury, that they're basically a big corrupt church, that they are all about kind of making money for themselves. They're not looking out for anyone else. Whereas the other way around, the Catholics think that the Protestants are basically breaking all the rules and not following who is supposed to be kind of God's supreme emissary on earth, the Pope, and therefore they are corrupt and so forth. Well, it's easier to talk about this when we have examples, so I'm going to go forward here. So the very first name on your lecture guide is Jacques Lemoyne de Morgue. Jacques Lemoyne de Morgue, and here you see his work, Rene Delodney and the Indian chief Authore visit Ribot's column. So what are we looking at here? In other words, what is the subject matter? Well, to get to that, let's start with who Rene Delodney was in the first place and kind of set the stage for this. In 1562, as you'll read in your textbook, a man by the name of Jean Ribaut, who was a Huguenot, which is the French name for a Protestant, is fleeing religious persecution in France. Again, this is one of the big reasons that people are colonizing the United States, or what becomes the United States, North America. They're fleeing religious persecution in their various nations. Now, oftentimes, like for instance, in this case, France wants to get rid of the Protestants anyway, and so they will grant charters, meaning you go through the aristocracy and the king, and you get the right to go off and colonize as long as you claim that land on behalf of the nation itself, and usually you have to pay something to the king along the way. So it's a win-win for the powers that be. In England, same thing. If you've got an Anglican or a Protestant leader and you are Catholic and you're feeling religious persecution, the king might grant you charter, or a very important lord or merchant might grant you charter to go to the United States and start your own colony there, as long as you, of course, give money back to the patron in these cases. So in this case, we're 1562, Jean Ribaut, who is a French Huguenot, is attempting to establish a colony on the east coast of Florida. It's at the mouth of the St. John's River, and he brings with him 5 columns, one of which you see here, to erect in order to basically claim this land for the French crown. Right? He then heads up from this area that you see here to modern day, what would be modern day South Carolina and Beaufort. Usually it looks like Beaufort, but they pronounce it Beaufort. And then, of course, this doesn't go very well. The Spanish end up coming in later and taking down this column and so forth. In any case, in 1564, so a couple of years later, another explorer and colonizer, Rene Delodney, whose name is in this title, comes to the same area that Jean Ribaut had come to, and he visits this column just to see, what's going on there. He later will establish a Fort Caroline nearby, and he brings with him, and this is very common for colonizers at this time, or explorers. Just about every explorer brought with them an artist, and that artist was also oftentimes a cartographer to document their trips. After all, people in Europe were really curious about what was this new world like, and you could make some money off of selling works of art or engravings of works of paintings and so forth, and also gain a lot of fame by doing this. So he brings this cartographer, who is also someone who is adept at painting, Jacques Lemoyne de Morgue. And they come to the site, and this is supposedly what they witness. They witness, they're greeted in this way by the chief of this nation, Authore. The people here, by the way, are the Timucuan people, an Aboriginal group of Florida, and the chief's name is Authore. So imagine that what these new colonists see, whether or not this is true, is a group of these Timucuan people, as well as Authore, basically worshiping this column that 2 years before had been erected by the French. Right? So The way that this story is told is you see off to the left-hand side groups of people on their knees with their hands raised as if they are venerating this column. The column itself is clearly indicative of the French kings of the time. As the text will point out, you have a sigil or a sign of the French Valois kings here, a crown over the top of 3 fleurs-de-lis. The fleur-de-lis is a stylized lily. So you see it there, it's that shape that is repeated 3 times. Looks a little bit like a bent trident or something like that. It's a symbol of royalty. It's specific to, not entirely specific, but it is very specific to the French in some ways, and then it gets adopted by some of the English kings as well, depending on family affiliations and so forth. So the column itself represents the idea that this is a French claim, right? And what we are hearing in this, or seeing in this representation, is the Aboriginal people of this place think that the French are basically gods and venerate them as if they are gods. They are treating this column as if it's like an altar. They put flowered garlands around it. They've brought all of these offerings to it. An offering, of course, is like you're making an offering to the god. We've got lots of different vegetables, lots of different fruits, corn, of course, or maize, which was a New World discovery, even a bow with a quiver full of arrows, right? So they're happy about it. Then we move over to the right-hand side, and we see Chief Attore, who is with Rene Delodney, who is dressed in the contemporary fashion of the French of this time. Now, this is where things get to me pretty interesting, and the text does a good job pointing this out. While on the one hand, we have this chief being a much bigger figure, which typically in works of art represents power. So from very, very early on, going all the way back to Egyptian times, if you represent something bigger, it means it's more important, whether or not the person is actually bigger. To kind of deflect that, we see that the chief is reaching around and basically putting his arm on the shoulder of the French colonist, right? Rene Delodney. On the other hand, it doesn't look so clear that the French is returning that embrace. After all, the belief system of the time in Europe was that these people are inferior to Europeans. And so he's kind of gazing at what's going on. You can't quite tell, at least I can't, what he's thinking at this point, but it does make an emphasis of putting that spear out across Chief Attore. And what does that say? Well, that's a way of saying, you know, we're more powerful than you. Of course we are. We have military force that you do not. In fact, even though you see a bow and quiver in the foreground, none of the Native Americans are armed. And yet behind Rene Delodney, you see more French soldiers, very prominent, very obvious French soldiers with that very particular helmet on their head. So the message here, again, to make this clear, is pretty interesting, isn't it? You can imagine that perhaps something like this would have occurred. I mean, we don't know for sure, but doesn't it make sense that the people of this time period would have wanted to emphasize the idea of prosperity in the New World, all kinds of promise of the New World, no conflict with the native peoples of this New World, easy takings, so to speak, right? Easy takings, both in terms of moving in and establishing colonies and not having to fear for the native peoples, as well as no conflict from other European nations. The French are supreme, right? Now, here's the thing. Is that entirely believable? Probably not, right? And there are some things to kind of make you stop and pause and think about what isn't accurate here. And we don't know everything, but we do know that native peoples, of course, aren't that light-skinned. We have some documentation later on that while this artist is paying very careful attention to the body adornment of the Timucuan people, and in particular the tattooing on the body of Attore, which By the way, lots of Europeans got fascinated with body tattooing of these people and documented it over and over again. We also know that there are some major inaccuracies here. One of the biggest ones, again pointed out by your text, is that some of the fruits and vegetables that you see here being offered aren't actually native to Florida, and there's no reason to suspect that the Timucuan people traveled, 800 miles to bring back some of these types of gourds to offer to this French column. Right? It's also clear, by the way, just from history, that the idea of a peaceful, easy colonization that's being shown here didn't really occur, because within a year of this painting, the Spanish come in, they wipe out this settlement, they take this column with them, and they set it up as a kind of joke in Havana, where they are in control. In any case, what I'm trying to point out here, and I'll keep doing this all the way through, is that works of art are representations that are less accurate to what actually occurred and perhaps more accurate to the aspirations or the ideological positions of the people who are doing the representing, because of course these people doing the representing, the artists, are products of their age and also want to please the public that they are hoping to sell their works of art to, or impress by their works of art. So then, moving ahead here, oh, by the way, I should have said this. Let me back up for a second here. I want to, especially early in the quarter, make mention of what these works of art are made out of. These are fairly small works. This is a gouache painting. Gouache is basically a heavily pigmented water-based paint. It doesn't have the same kind of luminosity that you would get out of an oil painting. It's like a fancy watercolor, and it's oftentimes used in these depictions of colonization or exploration. You might even say, and I should have said this as well, that when we're looking at Chief Ettore, that the way that he's represented, that body type of him, is not probably based upon something someone saw. It mimics very closely the way that European artists represented from way back, all the way back to Greek and Roman times, the god Apollo. Now, why would they do this? It's a really interesting thing, but while the term hadn't been coined yet, the idea of the noble savage, of these people being basically innately good, but needing to be taught, to be civilized, to be, in particular, given the correct religion, meaning Christianity, was in play even way back at this moment. And so you represent these figures like Greek gods in order to emphasize the idea that there's something innately noble about them. The artist is drawing from an earlier tradition of nobility, of greatness, to represent these people. And then the final thing I should have said before I go ahead is, I'd also like you to be looking at this and thinking about what European artists found interesting about the people that they're first coming in contact, the Aboriginal groups of North America. They seem really interested in the headdress and the hair. They seem very interested in body adornment and decorations and jewelry, right? They seem very interested in the exotic nature of these peoples, and we'll see that all the way through the 19th century. They will show you every once in a while, but far less often, some of the everyday activities of people. They very rarely take the time to figure out what those mean. They just take them to all be heathen approaches to the world. So they don't really collect any information about them, but they are drawn to the exotic nature of these others, these people who look different from them, act different from them, and so forth. So then moving ahead here, this is the artist John White. Now John White is he was originally an artist and an explorer who was associated with the Roanoke colony. Many of you have heard about this failed experiment of Sir Walter Raleigh. Again, we're English in this case. We're looking at an English colony up, around the area that's contemporary Virginia and so forth. And what happens here is that in 1587, the first major Roanoke expedition is set up. It's a colonization effort. The English, of course, grant free charters to people who want to colonize with the expectation that some of the bounty will be returned to the patron, in this case, Sir Walter Raleigh. It's also a way that a lot of groups of people who are being persecuted religiously can move to a new part of the world and set up shop and kind of run their own show. Roanoke, as many of you know, is one of those mysteries. In 1587, it's founded, but when John White, who is one of the first, he's the artist of this work, but he's also one of the first governors, returns to Great Britain in order to buttress his supplies. He's going to bring back more supplies. When he returns in 1590, the entire colony is gone without a trace, and no one knows exactly how that happens. John White, in any case, is very curious about, and his watercolors, one of which you see here, very interested in the peoples that he comes across. These people are generally known by the name Algonquin. The Algonquin people is a confederation of tribes of this area that all spoke a common language. They were named this, after the Algonquin Round Table of the Knights of King Arthur, so it doesn't really have anything much to do with their own way of thinking of themselves. But he did all of these watercolors to kind of document what he was coming across, and I just wanted to show you these because they're kind of precious, right? He here is documenting, this is a work that is called the Village of Pomowac, which shows you, how they set up their villages. We tend to, because of the stereotypes of representations of Native Americans, get locked in this idea that they're all living in, teepees or something. But of course, there are many, many different abodes. Many of you have taken courses on Native American culture, know that, on the eastern seaboard, one of the most common dwellings was something that became known as the wigwam. Of course, the Native people didn't call them that themselves, at least not in this part of the world, which are basically thatched huts with a kind of barrel vaulted roof. A little bit smaller versions, frankly, of the long houses that are used by the Iroquois people in particular. So you see those here. And then you see various events. Your textbook, if you follow my cursor on these, you'll see my cursor down on the bottom right hand. Textbook points out that he'll show you an entire big scene, and then you see this dancing festivity that the Francis Pohl calls a art celebration. It's probably some kind of ritual celebration, painted in a larger form to give you the details of that, or this over here, fire ceremony, or a close-up of one of these wigwams themselves. What really stands out to me is how organized this culture is, right? Europeans, by and large, will start to displace this idea of an organized nation with the idea of a savage group of people, because it facilitates their justification, I suppose, for taking over this land for themselves. As I said before, being able to say that these are a savage people allows you to say, well, they don't have any right to this land. We need to civilize them, and we need to put to use this land, which was a common way of rationalizing our kind of land grab of territory from these people. But what stands out to me is you've got roads, you've got ceremonies, you've got a standard form of housing. You even have very, very systematic planting of crops over here on the right-hand side. So bountiful agriculture. And like we saw with Rene Delodney, and I could bring in a million more examples of this, some of the early artists who are representing the peoples of the time are are quite focused on what they looked like and their exotic nature. So I just wanted to again show you a few of these. This is a representation of a medicine man. And notice how the artist is very carefully delineating the body type, but he's also spending a lot of attention on this kind of bird amulet that is in the man's hair, a pelt that is on one side, a bag full of probably some kind of herbs that are used in rituals on the other side. Warriors. So documentation in this case, this is John White of someone from a little bit further south. Notice how he is probably the Timucuan same people, or at least he's looking at Jacques Lemoyne de Morgue, who, by the way, he knows. I should have said this. De Morgue later in his life actually works for Sir Walter Raleigh, and so he's talking, these two artists are talking together, and he's probably looking at his works of art and adopting his own styles from that, because he's got the same headdress. He's very fascinated by the body markings, all this tattooing, and of course the weaponry here. Takes him completely out of context of anything else, you know, set up against this white background to show you the things that this artist thinks are important about these people. Again, another warrior here. Or a mother and a child carrying a gourd water carrying vessel and having in their hands, this is interesting, a European doll. So a little trinket given to the people to show this kind of generous nature, or this détente between the two. And again, I just find these things fascinating. I'm not going into great analysis of these at all. I just wanted to show you an artist, John White, who's very curious about documenting some of the various practices of these people, even if he doesn't give you much information in written form. He did write a little bit about this, though. This is the manner of their fishing, it is called. So you see, again, the documentation of a canoe. New thing filled with fish in there. They're even having a fire in the canoe to either keep warm or to cook some of their fish. They are pushing the fish towards, you see these kinds of nets, either to capture them with a multi-headed spear or to push them towards the fish traps that are over on the left-hand side. The artist isn't trying to make this look realistic, is he? What he's trying to do is show you as much information as he can. Obviously the fish aren't floating up here in the air and you wouldn't be able to see them back here, but he wants you to see how bountiful and plentiful the fish are. Now this functions in a couple of different ways, of course. It doesn't just show you the fishing practices and the way that these people use, basically traps to catch their fish and various different spears and so forth, and canoes. It's also meant to say to, to the English patrons, look at what you can come get. Now you might not think fish is a big deal, but at this time, in fact, the very first reason people got interested in the eastern seaboard from Europe is they didn't even bother to colonize. They just sent fishing vessels over to collect cod because it was a big industry at the time. Or a Pomoak village here. So you see this, in this case, basically a fortified village with these larger wigwams around it and a ceremony in the middle here. And again, as the text points out, these close-ups of feasting or ritual ceremonies being shown in a larger context and then giving you almost like a thumbnail sketch in there and a large blow-up of that image in a separate watercolor. Or some things that are quite curious. This is a ossuary temple where you see the deceased bodies laid out in this temple, probably a form of ancestor veneration. So one of the key images that is pointed to in John White in your textbook is this image of a man and a woman eating, Indians of Florida. And what we see here is probably a fairly accurate representation of a husband and a wife sitting on a mat eating some beans, so a common food, and the way that they would do that. And one of the reasons that the text focuses in on this so much is it wants to point something out that I think is pretty interesting. A lot of artists are drawing from each other more than they're drawing from actual observation of the people that are their subject matter. So in this case, John White is showing you an image of something that we suppose that he has seen, right? And we see the Native Americans represented with a little bit darker skin, their animal furs, the woman in particular looking directly down at the beans with a smile on her face, the man looking at her as if she's pleased by that. But if we then move on to our next major artist, Theodore de Bruy. Theodore de Bruy, by the way, is kind of a French-Flemish artist. He comes from the northern part of France, which at this point was being passed back and forth between the Dutch and the Spanish at the time, and he actually is someone who is aligned with the Protestants. So he's sent along on, he's an artist who's sent along on these exploratory expeditions as an artist. And what he does is he supposedly documents what he sees and then in sketches, and then he turns these into engravings. So you see Theodore de Bruy's reinterpretation of the John White watercolor on the right hand side. An engraving, for those of you who don't know, is a print, right? So the artist directly, and you can look this up, engraves with a stylus in the surface of usually a soft metal plate like copper or zinc, and then through the process of printing is able to transfer that image into multiple copies. That's one of the preferred methods for distributing images such as these, in that you can make a sketch, then turn it into an engraving or into an etching and reproduce multiple copies of this along with print and sell those as subscriptions, which is what Theodore de Bruy did. In fact, this is one of the images that comes from a larger series, a book that was sold as limited subscriptions in various chapters, known as The Great Voyages. And this one comes from the History of America, or the Historia Americae, from the 1590s. So I'm going to ask you to just kind of look at these for a moment and notice what the differences are, and ask yourself a little bit about what those differences might mean. So on the one hand, one of the things that I want to point out is that the poses of the characters have changed quite a bit. Now, why might that be the case? Why would you, on the left-hand side, have them taking this pose that's almost a squatting pose, and then on the right-hand side, have them kind of bend their legs out further? The explanation that's given by the text, I think, is at least partially, partially compelling. The likely way that people would have eaten, these people would have eaten, is in the squatting method that you see over there on the left. But that's so foreign to people in Europe that the artist, Theodore de Bruy, when he goes to reproduce these for people, sees that as looking uncomfortable. It's out of his area of experience. And so he decides to basically have them spread their legs out, right? But the other part is equally important. The artist is thinking about the traditions of representation in European painting. And he's thinking, hey, the way to create a pleasing composition, the way to make it comfortable, the way to really show people that I know how to render anatomy, right? To draw anatomy correctly, which was a very big thing in the European tradition. It's part of the entire idea behind classical arts, right? You have to know how to represent the body accurately, know how to represent each muscle and so forth. You can't do that as well if you follow the composition, the way that the bodies are composed over on the left. You can do it a lot better if you do it the way that you see it over on the right. The other thing that is added here is, along with the beans that must have seemed quite meager to someone like Theodore de Bruy, and thus not very compelling to his audience, which would have been people who are thinking about maybe colonizing North America, or sending people, patronizing colonists, or frankly even people are thinking about business opportunities, like what kind of money can you make if you start a business there, start a merchant business. He adds other things, right? Things that show the bounty. He adds some fish, he adds a squid, he adds more maize over there, which is a huge cash crop, and it's going to be here. In other words, there's more that you can have. The final thing is something really interesting, I think, and it's something that we are going to pick up over and over again in this class, which is in the way that he represents the woman. Instead of her smiling as she did in Theodore de Bruy's, in John White's picture, and looking at the beans like, these beans are going to be good. In the work by Theodore de Bruy, she smiles and she looks at us. That is absolutely part of the European tradition of the female nude. And it would have been quite provocative of this time. There were lots of stories coming back about these scantily clad women. Now, they were always seen as kind of savages, but on the other hand, it was a kind of fantasy to a lot of people. And in this case, what you have is a woman whose face has been anglicized some, right? It's been turned into it's been more idealized to look more like a Caucasian face. And she turns to look at us as if to say, with that slight smile on her face, I know you're looking at me and I like that, which is part of that European tradition of representing female nudes. And we'll pick that up, of course, later on in this quarter. Right, so here's a close-up of that just so you can see a little bit better. Now, the main thing to talk about with Theodore de Bruy is that, of course, he is someone who's predisposed to align himself with the Protestants. And that means that the Catholics, and in particular the Spanish, who, of course, are up there in his home country, in his kind of neck of the woods, constantly in conflict with the Protestant nations of Flanders and what today we think of as the Netherlands. He is going to represent the Spanish in America and their activities in the most negative light. And who, at this time, besides the Spanish, is going to be someone who's going to be able to say, no, that's not how it actually went down. So in this case, you see a work, part of this series of engravings that was produced for the history of America. And its title is Hanging by the Order of Diego Ocampa of the Rebellious Caribs. Caribs meaning Caribbeans. So Diego Ocampa was a Spanish general. He was someone who was a explorer. I think we know that the Spanish were pretty horrible in their conquest of various groups of people, but kind of so was everybody else to some degree. However, here you've got an artist who aligns himself with the Protestants, who absolutely wants everyone to think about how bad the Spanish are acting in this part of the world. In other words, the ideological assumption or the perspective of this artist is going to find its way in the way he represents this supposed history of the Americas. So again, Great Voyages and the History of America is a 32-volume series of illustrated accounts of these European explorations. It was first widely available, the first widely available and read of such illustrations in Europe. It was almost always anti-Catholic, pro-English, or at least pro-Anglican, and went out of its way, of course, to vilify the Spanish or demonize them. It also, so what do you see here, right? You see this hanging of native peoples over an open flame after they're, to burn up the evidence, I suppose, or just to make them look even more horrible. You see a man dressed in Spanish garb off to the left-hand side, holding a baby and getting ready to dash him against a wall. You see in the background people being clubbed to death. And then you see a Spanish galleon in the harbor itself, so that you know exactly who the bad guys are. This is the way that the Catholics treat, those that they colonize, it's saying. This is, anti-Catholic sentiment. But it's also something that promotes the idea of, I'm saying it, on the one hand, it's anti-Catholic, but it's also promoting, at least implicitly, the idea of the approach that the English take to colonization, trade, and settlement. And as such, as saying, the English don't do this, that the British are much more prone to let people come on their own accord and to very nicely interact with the native people. It is promoting the idea of private colonization of the America rather than state-funded colonization of the Americas, which of course is the way that the Spanish go about it, the British go about it as private colonies. And then I think finally it's worth saying that in the background of a lot of these images that I'm going to show you by Bruy, the native peoples are shown as savages. Even if they're horribly killed here, they're almost always shown partially clothed, without any religion. They're not putting to use the land that they're living on, which for people in Europe, what meant that land was uncultivated and therefore, was being left to rot, so to speak. If they're not putting it to use, we will. And so it gave people the idea that it was completely all right to go colonize these areas. After all, you were going to be doing these people a favor. You're going to be basically treating them much more nicely than the Spanish would otherwise. You are going to show them how to make the land bountiful and to prosper themselves while making something of that land yourself. So let me just show you a couple more of these images. I'm not going to do quite as much talking about it, just to show you, right, what we're getting at when we see Theodore de Bruy's. And he's not the only one doing this. So in this case, this work is usually titled, again, Balboa has thrown before the dogs Indians who committed the godless crime of sodomy. Okay, so here we've got Balboa. He is a Spanish general again, or an explorer. You see all the Spanish represented in their regalia in the background. Very typical Spanish expedition garb. So warriors back there with heavily armored. You see Balboa right in the middle there. He's dressed, if you follow my cursor, he's got this big spear in his hand. He's dressed a little bit more foppishly than the others with a fancy collar. He's ordered that all of these heathens, and again, notice, they're heathens. They need religion, to be eaten by the hounds because they're practicing sodomy, by which he goodness knows what he means, but basically probably means something like forms of sex that are not about procreation, that are about that are basically fun forms. I don't know. I'm just joking there. And he, again, the big thing is, it's not like the English would have been, oh, sodomy, let's go for it, it's all fine. But they wouldn't have treated him this way. What the artist is trying to say is something like, Spanish, they're bad. They see some act that runs counter to their religion, and instead of teaching people the right way to act, they just kill them off. This is how the Spanish treat the people that they're colonizing. It's up to us to get there and do it the right way, right? So you see an emphasis by placing in the foreground these dogs eating up the Native Americans, who don't look particularly Native American, frankly, I have to say. Heads have been cut off in the foreground to emphasize, again, by putting this in the foreground, it's really putting it in our face, while standing tritely behind them, completely armed to the teeth. No way that they could possibly be in fear for anything, are those villainous Spaniards. So more of these, right? The beating of Native American people. or what is this one called? Women raped by the Spanish, right? So you've got the Spanish actually raping the women. The Revenge of the Native Americans, or the indigenous people here. This is Indians Take Revenge on the Priests. So the Spanish priests, of course, are Catholics. And of course, the Spanish are proselytizing quite forcefully at this time. They're setting up missionary churches. They're converting, supposedly, by force, Native American peoples to Christianity. And this is the wrong way to do it because it's by force. And frankly, in the background of this, and you see the Native Americans or the Aboriginal peoples basically destroying these priests, in the background of the story, implicitly, is the idea that the Spanish probably have it coming, that the Catholic Church itself is, not acting in the true manner of religion, that they are not really there to better the native peoples. Instead, what they're trying to do is basically trick the native peoples into giving over things that are rightly theirs. So that the problem isn't that you're trying to convert the Native Americans, it's the way that you're trying to convert them that's very closely aligned with Catholicism by, again, Theodore de Bruy, who is inclined towards Protestant belief systems and English or British forms of colonization. Before we go into portraiture, I just want to let you know that, again, there are wonderful, wonderful works of art by the indigenous peoples of North America that are a big part of courses at the University of Washington and elsewhere that this class is not attempting to deal with. This is a work of art that is basically this beautiful, beautiful shawl that would have been worn by a Native American, we believe by a Native American leader, what we call a chief, that is one of the earliest of the collected art forms of these people. It's actually 4 different pieces of white-tailed deer hide, very carefully cured, and then adorned with beadwork. And the beads are actually shells in the shapes of the chief in the middle, and off to the right-hand side, you can probably barely see this, but if you follow my cursor, these little indications of hooved feet probably means a white-tailed deer over here, and these paws over here may reference the this animal being a cougar or a mountain lion from the area. So I'm going to pause here. This is the end of part 1 of this lecture, and I'll pick this up going into early portraiture in part 2.